Here is something the government has not explained. On the 13th of June 2026, bandits in Katsina State released the body of a retired Major General, a man who had spent nearly 3 decades defending this country, for burial. His family received the remains, they held the funeral, thousands attended. But when journalists asked his son how the body was transferred from the bandits, the son said, and I want you to hear this clearly, "We don't know how our father's corpse was released." The government issued a statement, the president issued condolences, officials praised the fallen general's service. And while all of that was happening, while the tributes were being read and the cameras were rolling, his wife, Hajia Amina Abubakar, was still in that forest, still in captivity, still being held by the same men who killed her husband. The bandits gave back the body, the government said thank you, and they moved on. So here is the question I want you to hold for the next 30 minutes. When a country can no longer protect the man who used to speak for its military, what exactly is that country protecting? Before we go any further, if you are new to this channel, welcome. Naija Insight Desk exists for one reason, to give you the kind of analysis that goes beyond the headlines and the noise. Subscribe now, because this conversation is about to get deeper. Let us establish what actually happened and why it matters beyond the tragedy itself. On the 30th of May 2026, retired Major General Rabe Abubakar and his wife were traveling along the Maraba Musawa Kathin Suli Road in Matazu local government area of Katsina State. This was not a war zone, this was a public road in Nigeria's northwest in broad daylight. His driver was shot. He survived with a gunshot wound and managed to escape. The general and his wife were dragged into the forest. Now, before we go further, let's be precise about who this man was, because the government's response only makes sense when you understand exactly who they failed to protect. Major General Rabe Abubakar was not just any retired officer. He served as the Director of Defense Information, the official public voice of the Nigerian Armed Forces. He was the face behind the microphone when Nigeria's military wanted to communicate with Nigerians and with the world. He was the man the institution trusted to tell Nigeria's security story. He spent close to 3 decades in that institution, and on May 30th, he was ambushed on a civilian road and taken by men with guns who the same institution has been fighting for years. By the 6th of June, 1 week into captivity, a video surfaced online. In that video, General Rabe and his wife appeared before a camera, pleading directly with the Katsina State government. The message was clear: meet the bandits' demands, or we will not survive. The demands we now know were the release of 3 detained fighters and the return of livestock seized during security operations. Let that land. Armed criminals who have killed soldiers, kidnapped civilians, and terrorized entire communities were asking the government to release their own arrested members. And they were using a retired general and his wife as the bargaining chip. The government did not meet the demands. On the 13th of June, the Katsina State government confirmed what many feared. Retired Major General Rabe Abubakar was dead. The official cause of death: complications from diabetes and hypertension while in captivity. But here is where it gets more complicated, and this is the first open loop I want you to hold. There are 2 versions of what killed this man. The government says it was his health conditions. A commissioner for Internal Security and Home Affairs issued a statement that used the words natural death. But security sources quoted in Daily Post Nigeria said, and I want you to hear this clearly, security authorities had received information indicating that the retired military officer was killed by his abductors. 2 official narratives, same event, and the family says they do not know how the body was even returned to them. We will come back to that contradiction because it matters more than it appears right now. 3 generals, 8 months, and the Nigerian government official response each time has been condolences, a statement, and a press conference. Let me show you the pattern, because this is not the first time. This is the third senior military officer Nigeria has lost in under 8 months. In November 2025, Brigadier General Musa Uba, commander of the 25th Task Force Brigade in Damboa, Borno State, was ambushed by ISWAP on a patrol near Wajiroko village. He became separated from his troops. He communicated his location using WhatsApp on his personal phone. A rescue helicopter was deployed. He could not be found. 3 days later, ISWAP announced on its propaganda outlet Amak that it had captured, interrogated, and executed him. In April 2026, less than 5 months later, Brigadier General Oseni Braima, commander of the 29th Task Force Brigade in Benishek, Borno State, was killed when ISWAP launched a coordinated overnight assault on his base. The base was overrun, vehicles were torched, 18 soldiers died alongside him. President Tinubu praised his courage in a statement and called the attack a sign of desperation from the insurgents. And now, in June 2026, Major General Rabe Abubakar, no longer in uniform, no longer commanding troops, simply traveling to his hometown, dead in bandit captivity. 3 generals, 2 active, 1 retired, 3 different security threats, ISWAP in the northeast, bandits in the northwest, and a single consistent institutional failure running through all 3 cases. So let us ask the institutional question directly. What is the Nigerian security architecture actually doing? The Nigerian Army operates under a command structure that includes the Chief of Army Staff, the Defense Headquarters under the Chief of Defense Staff, and multiple theater commands, Operation Hadinkai in the northeast, various operations in the northwest. There are intelligence agencies, the DSS, military intelligence, the NIA. There is the National Security Advisor's Office coordinating across all of them. And yet, a retired general was kidnapped on a public road, held for 2 weeks, appeared in a hostage video, and died in captivity before any of those structures could reach him. Now, here is where the institutional failure goes deeper than the surface story. The bandits who kidnapped General Rabe issued specific concrete demands: release 3 detained fighters, return seized livestock. Those demands were refused. That refusal, on principle, is defensible. Governments that negotiate with kidnappers create incentives for more kidnappings. That is a legitimate policy position, and we will steelman it properly in a few minutes. But here is the institutional question the government has not answered. If you will not negotiate, what is your rescue plan? Because the 2 things are not automatic opposites. A government can refuse to release detained fighters and simultaneously execute a rescue operation. Special forces exist for exactly this scenario. Intelligence assets exist for exactly this scenario. The question is not whether to negotiate. The question is whether there was any credible alternative put in place. The evidence on the ground suggests there was not. General Rabe was in captivity for 14 days. No rescue operation succeeded, and his wife remains in that forest right now as this video is being made. There is a second institutional failure buried in this story that almost nobody is talking about. General Rabe was the former Director of Defense Information. In that role, he was the public face of the Nigerian military. He would have security protocols, contacts, networks, people who know how to respond to threats against former senior officers. And yet, there is no evidence that any of those protocols activated in time to save him. Which raises a question that is uncomfortable but necessary. Does Nigeria have any functioning protection framework for retired senior military officers? Because if the answer is no, and the evidence strongly suggests it is, then what message does that send to every serving officer watching this right now? There is something else going on in this story that the government statement carefully avoided. We're going to get to it, but first, let's talk about who benefits from the current arrangement. Now, if what you just heard challenges what you thought you knew, drop it in the comments. I want to hear your read on this before we get to the part that reframes everything.
Let us be clinical about the political calculus here, because there are several actors in this story, and not all of them are telling you what they actually want. The federal government's position is on its surface principled. President Tinubu's statement after General Rabe's death said this: "While the terrorists have done their worst, the government will never bow to their demand to release their members held by our security agencies." He added, and this is important, that windows of surrender for bandits will not remain open forever. That is the language of strength. It is also the language of a government that needs to project authority going into a 2027 election cycle in which its handling of insecurity is one of its most exposed vulnerabilities. Here is the political reality Tinubu is navigating. The Northwest, Katsina, Zamfara, Sokoto, Kebbi, Kano, are electorally critical. These states have large voter populations. They have experienced the most concentrated banditry crisis in the country over the past several years. If Tinubu's administration is seen as soft on bandits, or worse, as complicit in their continued operation, it bleeds support in a zone it cannot afford to lose in 2027. But here's the contradiction. Being seen as tough and actually solving the problem are not the same thing, and ordinary Nigerians in the Northwest are increasingly able to tell the difference. The death of General Rabe did not happen in a vacuum. It happened one day after Democracy Day, June 12th, on which President Tinubu gave a national address and spoke about Nigerian security challenges. The next morning, the same government was announcing the death of a retired general in bandit captivity. That timing is not lost on political observers. The Katsina State government is in an even more difficult position. Governor Dikko Rada described the incident as a dark moment. His commissioner used the words tragic loss. But the Katsina State government was aware of the kidnapping from May 30th. They were aware of the ransom demands from June 6th. They watched the hostage videos circulate, and they still could not prevent General Rabe's death. Katsina is Buhari's home state. It is a state that has been dealing with banditry for years, under Buhari and now under Tinubu. For this to happen in Katsina to a man of this profile is a direct embarrassment for the state government and for the APC's credibility in a state it has held for years. The opposition and former senior military officers went on record within hours of the announcement to blame the federal government directly. One former general described General Rabe's death as a failure of the federal government in addressing the worsening insecurity. The opposition has a ready-made narrative. If the government cannot protect a man who once spoke for its military, can it protect anyone? Now, here is the second-order political consequence that most commentators are missing. General Rabe's wife is still in captivity. The government has refused to negotiate. That is its position. But every day that Hajia Amina remains in that forest, the government is living with a visible, ongoing, real-time demonstration of the limits of its security architecture. There is no way to issue a press statement that makes that disappear. Every day she is not rescued is a day the government's claim to authority in the Northwest is publicly tested and publicly failing. And if she dies in captivity, which, God forbid, remains a possibility, the political consequences for the Tinubu administration going into 2027 will be severe. But here's the thing nobody is asking. Are the bandits winning, not just militarily, but strategically? Because what they did with this kidnapping was more sophisticated than most people have acknowledged. Let me show you why.
The strategic significance of this kidnapping goes far beyond one man, as devastating as his loss is. When armed non-state actors successfully kidnap the former voice of the Nigerian military, the man who used to stand behind a podium and tell Nigerians and the world about military victories, and then hold him for 2 weeks while the full machinery of state watches, and then return his body, and his wife is still missing, that is a message, a deliberate one. The message is this: there is no one we cannot reach. There is no title that protects you. There is no road that is safe. That is not just a security failure. That is a psychological operation. And it is working, because the fear it generates is not confined to retired generals. It is spreading through communities across the Northwest, through serving officers who are watching this story closely, through civil servants and business people and ordinary families who travel those same roads. The economic dimension of this story is almost never discussed, but it is real. The Northwest is one of Nigeria's most agriculturally productive regions. Katsina, Zamfara, Sokoto, these states are breadbasket territory. But sustained banditry is making farming impossible in large parts of the region. Farmers cannot go to their fields, markets are disrupted, food supply chains are under pressure. This feeds directly into Nigeria's inflationary crisis, a crisis that the government is already struggling to manage. For ordinary Nigerians in the Northwest, the ones furthest from power, the ones with no generator when the lights go out and no private security when the gunmen come, this story is not abstract. They live with the knowledge that the state cannot protect a retired general. What chance do they have? The security implications for the military itself are profound. Junior and mid-ranking officers are watching what happens to General Uba, General Brima, and now General Rabe. The implicit contract between the state and its military is that the institution protects its own. 3 generals in 8 months challenges that contract. And a demoralized officer corps, one that feels abandoned, is less effective in the field, which means the security situation gets worse, not better, which means more kidnappings, which means more pressure on the bellament. It is a cycle with no natural exit. There is a continental dimension to this story that the domestic conversation almost entirely ignores. Nigeria's northwest sits along a corridor that connects the Sahel, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger to the more stable coastal states. The same banditry networks operating in Katsina and Zamfara have documented links to jihadist networks in the Sahel. This is not a purely domestic criminality problem. It is part of a regional security architecture that is deteriorating. The military coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, 3 of Nigeria's ECOWAS neighbors, were all justified in part by the failure of civilian governments to contain insurgency and banditry. The coup leaders in each case pointed to exactly the kind of security failures we are discussing today. Generals dying, roads unsafe, communities abandoned. Nigeria has resisted that pattern. Its democratic institutions have held, imperfectly, but they have held. But a democratic argument requires the democratic government to demonstrate competence, and a government that cannot rescue a retired general from bandits within 2 weeks is struggling to make that case. For the Nigerian diaspora, particularly in the UK and US, this story lands as confirmation of something many left Nigeria to escape. The sense that the state cannot protect you, that your life is ultimately negotiable, that who you are and what you have done does not grant you any reliable measure of security. That feeling drives emigration, and Nigeria cannot afford to lose more of its educated, mobile, skilled citizens to a security crisis it has not solved. Nigeria is also in an increasingly complex relationship with the United States militarily. As recently as May 2026, a joint US-Nigerian operation killed Abu Bilal al-Minuki in the northeast. That operation was significant, but the optics of a successful US-Nigerian joint operation in Borno existing simultaneously with the government being unable to rescue a retired general from bandits in Katsina point to the same fundamental question. Nigeria's security architecture is effective in some theaters and almost absent in others. That inconsistency is a vulnerability that both domestic and international observers are noting. Let me steelman the government's position because it deserves an honest hearing before we challenge it. The strongest argument in favor of the government's refusal to negotiate is also the most defensible one. If you release detained fighters in exchange for a hostage, you guarantee more kidnappings. You create a market. You tell every armed group in Nigeria that the way to free their captured members is to grab a prominent civilian and wait. That is not a policy. That is a surrender agreement with delayed terms. The government is right to resist it. The second argument is one of operational complexity.
rescue operations in dense bush terrain, in an area where bandits have deep local knowledge and human intelligence networks, are genuinely dangerous. Failed rescue operations can result in the immediate execution of hostages. There are documented cases worldwide of hostages who died because a rescue attempt was launched. The government may have assessed that the risk to General Rabe's life was higher with a military rescue than without one. That is a painful calculation, but it is a legitimate one. Now, here is where the steelman breaks down. The government's position only holds if refusal to negotiate is paired with a credible, ongoing, capable rescue capacity. If you will not talk and you cannot rescue, then you are not being principled, you are being helpless and calling it principle. And there is the second misconception that needs to be addressed directly, the one circulating heavily on social media. There is a viral image claiming to show armed bandits formally handing over General Rabe's body to government officials. Daily Trust has flagged this as unverified. The family itself says it does not know the circumstances of the body's return. This matters because if the body was quietly negotiated back, if some informal arrangement was made behind the scenes to retrieve the remains, while the government publicly maintained a position of no negotiation, then what we are looking at is not principle, it is performance. And performance is not the same as security policy. The nuance being lost in the noise is this: the debate is being framed as negotiate or don't negotiate. That's a false binary. The real question, the one that should be driving Nigeria's security conversation right now, is why after years of banditry in the Northwest, there is still no reliable, functioning rescue infrastructure, no rapid response unit with the specific mandate to retrieve kidnapped victims in that terrain, no early warning system that would have intercepted the threat before General Rabe was taken. Those are institutional questions, and they require institutional answers, not press statements. There is one final thing this story tells us about 2027, about the social contract, and about what Nigerians are being asked to accept as normal. And I think it is the most important thing I have said in this entire video.
Let us talk about what comes next and what to watch. Most likely scenario in the next 30 days, the Katsina State government will intensify pressure on bandit groups through a combination of military operations and, quietly, back-channel engagement with the aim of securing Hajia Amina's release. If she's released alive, the government will present this as a security success. If she dies in captivity, the political consequences for both the state government and the Tinubu administration will be significant heading into primary season. Second scenario. Federal pressure on the Northwest bandits escalates militarily with more airstrikes and joint operations. This has happened before, and the pattern is that operations cause temporary dispersal but not structural defeat of the groups. The problem is that the banditry in the Northwest is not purely ideological. It is deeply entangled with cattle-rustling networks, local political economies, and ethnic tensions that a military operation alone cannot resolve. Third scenario, the one nobody wants to say out loud, nothing changes. The government issues stronger statements, there are more operations, a few commanders are arrested or killed, and 6 months from now, another prominent Nigerian, former official, retired military officer, business person, is taken from a public road in the Northwest, and the cycle continues. What to watch specifically? Watch whether Hajia Amina is released, and if so, under what terms. The terms of her release will tell you more about government policy than any official statement ever will. Watch the 2027 primary positioning in Katsina and Zamfara. If APC governors in the Northwest cannot point to measurable security improvements by mid-2026, they will face internal party pressure and potentially credible opposition challengers. Watch whether the military introduces any new structural changes in response to 3 generals lost in 8 months. A genuine institutional response would involve new protocols for retired senior officers, upgraded intelligence coverage of bandit corridors, and possibly a dedicated hostage rescue unit. Absence of those changes would confirm that the response is political, not operational. The 12-month trajectory. If the current approach holds, no negotiation, insufficient rescue capacity, reactive rather than preventive security, The Northwest will continue to deteriorate. The cost, economically and humanly, falls primarily on communities that are already among Nigeria's most marginalized, and it becomes increasingly difficult for the Tinubu administration to run a credible national security narrative going into 2027. I asked you at the beginning of this video, when a country can no longer protect the man who used to speak for its military, what exactly is that country protecting? Here is my honest answer. It is protecting a position, a policy stance, a political narrative. It is protecting the appearance of strength, because strength itself, the functional kind, the kind that keeps citizens alive, is harder to manufacture than a press statement. Major General Rabe Abubakar dedicated his career to defending Nigeria and communicating its military's actions to the world. He retired. He drove. He got in a car. He drove toward home, and the country he served could not get him back. That is not a tragedy to be mourned and moved past. It is an indictment of a security architecture that is reactive when it needs to be preventive, theatrical when it needs to be operational, and principled in press conferences while being powerless in the field. His wife is still out there. And until that changes, the government's thank you is not enough. If this analysis gave you clarity, not agreement, clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what is actually happening. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.